Okay,
There we go. Thank you.
all right. Well, I'm really happy to be here to talk about this is sort of a passion of mine. The book jacket that you see over on in the screen is not actually how the book turned out to look. It actually is Below Baltimore, an archaeology of Charm City. And my co-author and I, who I want to give a shout out to, Adam Fracchia, wanted it to be called Below Charm City, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. And the press really fought us on it, and they wanted to just call it Below Baltimore, and they didn't want to include the subtitle, which at all. And we said it's really important that Charm City be in the title, and they're like, nope, it's not going to happen. We can't market it that way. And so we fought about it for an entire meeting. And finally, I said, this is a deal breaker. It has to have Charm City in the title somewhere. So we ended up compromising, calling it Below Baltimore, an archaeology of Charm City. It it got in there, but it was a struggle. I'm not really sure I understand how presses work, but anyway, they never like the titles that you want to give to a book. So, but one of Adam's students designed the cover and they simplified it, which I think was good. But they stuck with the same concept. All right. And this book came about in sort of an odd way. I had been director at the Mac Lab for about, I don't know, 12 years or so. And the collections, there's 10 million archaeological artifacts in the Mac Lab. And it's just like an archaeologist's dream come true to have all of these 10 million artifacts at your disposal that you can just go back and put your hands on at any time. And I found myself really drawn to the Baltimore collections. And I spent the better part of a decade looking at those collections when I could get a chance and working with students and interns on those collections. And I finally, in doing some, writing of blogs and things about the collections. And I decided that I wanted to write a book about the archaeology of Baltimore. And so I went to the Society for Historical Archaeology conference and I walked up to the book room and there was Adam Fracchia standing there, and he had borrowed a collection from the lab for his doctoral research, and he had recently finished his dissertation. And so I congratulated him and said, Adam, are you going to turn your dissertation into a book? And he said, no, I'm just getting ready to go into the book room and talk to the University of Florida Press about writing a book on the archaeology of Baltimore. And I said, oh God, I was just getting ready to go do the same thing. And then in a heartbeat, I said, listen, why don't we write it together? And that's how this book came about. So that was sort of a spur of the minute decision that turned out to be a nice thing. All right, now I've got to figure out how to change my slides, Matthew. Let's see.
I would explain it if I could. If you're in,
There we
there
go.
we go. You did it.
It's clicking, the keyboard wasn't working. All right, so I want to start the story tonight in the Inner Harbor area near Bar Street. And this was a project that was, it's where Camden Yards is now. If y'all are, I assume most of you guys are pretty familiar with Baltimore. And I want to start with the home of Francis and Thomas Whittington, and they moved to Maryland from Virginia right after the War of 1812, and built themselves, lived in a pretty fashionable row house there. And Thomas died heavily in debt in 1826, and Frances and her two teenage daughters continued to live in this house, in this row house in Baltimore. And eventually around 1832, one of her daughters got married to a lumber merchant, and the lumber merchant moved in and they started having kids. And then at some point, and I still don't know exactly when yet, in the late 1830s, they had substantial damage to their house from fire. And they ended up moving out of the house, cleaning it out, moving out into Baltimore County, where we see them in the 1840 census out on a farm there. And so how do we know all of this stuff? Well, some of it is historical research. And some of it we learned about in 1989 when an archaeological contracting firm did archaeology in advance of the Camden Yards Stadium being built. And one of the things that they found was a privy structure, nice brick lined privy with a brick foundation structure over it. The privy pit measured 9 by 6 feet. And it was fairly deep, as you can see there in this field photograph. And when they started digging it, they found that it was 20% soil and 80% artifacts. So pretty incredible. Looked like it was filled in sometime in the 1830s. There were over 500 ceramic vessels alone, and not quite as many glass vessels, but you can see a lot of the ceramics mended to almost complete vessels. And a lot of the glass that you can see, like this really beautiful cut leaded glass tumbler with a strawberry fan design, you can see all of the soot that was on it from the fire. And some of the other stuff had fire damage as well. The wet conditions in that privy preserved all sorts of seeds, like you can see here in the lower left, peaches and cherries and grapes, some kind of squash or melon. There was a lot of wood and leather preservation. The family had 4 children, two young sons and 2 young daughters, and there was ample evidence of the kids. You can see the children's shoes, leather shoes that were preserved. And then this little strange looking thing on the top of the screen is part of a doll cradle. So it's fairly small, and we had numerous pieces of that, and it was made with painted wood. And then this is a medicine bottle that you can see over on the right-hand side. And so what happened was when the interior of this house was damaged by fire, and a lot of the contents were damaged, it seems like what the family did was clean out the house and then just dumped everything that was damaged into the privy, because there were really no sort of standardized garbage pickup at the time. And so that's what people were doing, is that they were throwing everything in their privies, which is what makes privies such an interesting thing for archaeologists to excavate. Another interesting thing about this very same feature, so if you look at the sketch drawing or the plan drawing in the lower right, you can see the outline of the 9 by 6 foot structure that held the privy building. And then once the Whittingtons had filled up the vault of their privy with their garbage, but later on, George Ruth, who was Babe Ruth's father, purchased that property, and he opened a tavern or a saloon in it. And if you look at the photograph on the top right, you can see his father is the first person on the right-hand side. And they served, obviously, alcohol, and people came and played, gambled and things like that. And so the privy building was still standing. And so they took 2 barrels and sort of dug down into the Whittington privy fill and set those barrels in and used those as their privy pits for that saloon. And those barrels were filled with all sorts of animal bone, butchered animal bone from the food that they were serving at the tavern, liquor bottles like you can see here, dice, jaw harps and things like that that talk really all about, you know, this particular property being used as a saloon. And the interesting thing is if you go to Camden Yards, this privy pit was right at where second base is now. So if you go in and think about it, you'll know exactly where the Ruth Saloon and Francis Whittington's house were. So when I started thinking about this book, in my early career, my boss was Ivor Noel Hume. And if any of y'all have read anything that he has written, you know that he loves to tell a story. And so I think I was really trained up in that. Let's see what archaeology can reveal about people from the past and stories. And certainly we can do that with scientific methods and you know, math and counting and statistics and all of that. But I think to really reach out and touch really the general public and get them interested, you need to tell these stories that people can relate to. And so that's what I've tried to do in this book and throughout my career. And so you'll hear a lot of what we call micro histories tonight. We decided to really kind of hone in on individual families and stories. Cities can be big and impersonal. And a lot of times I think archaeology is difficult in a city setting because people move around so much and it's kind of hard to associate particular sites with specific people. So we really tried to do that as much as possible, or at least to try to figure out sort of who generally was living in a neighborhood, whether it was like an Italian or an Irish American neighborhood or a Black neighborhood and that sort of thing. All right. Baltimore, by the mid 1830s, was the second largest city in the United States, and it grew fairly rapidly after it sort of got its initial foothold. Most of the archaeology that has been done, and mostly what I'm going to talk about tonight, has taken place in the older neighborhoods down around the Inner Harbor. Otterbein, Fells Point, Canton, Federal Hill, Jones Falls, those areas. And is anybody familiar with this illustration of early Baltimore? It was.
I've seen it, but I wouldn't say I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, this is an 1817 reinterpretation of a 1752 drawing that was done of Baltimore, of all of the buildings that were in Baltimore. And this is a much more three-dimensional interpretation of what Mold or Moel did in 1752. And so you can see in the mid-18th century, Baltimore really was much more rural than it was urban. And that really a lot of the houses were more like urban farmsteads. But it grew really quickly. This is a map that was done in 1866. And so you can see this area here is this area. So you can see how quickly in just over 100 years, how much the city had developed. So some of the topics that we wanted to talk about in the book when we sort of sat down and decided what we wanted to focus on is we really wanted to look at sort of the growth of the city, the growth and change in different neighborhoods over time, what industries were taking place in Baltimore, how people were obtaining their food and other goods. So we focused a lot on looking at markets. We wanted to know what cultural groups, ethnic groups were coming into Baltimore at different time periods and what archaeology could tell us about them, particularly in the 19th century, mid-19th century to the early 20th century, when you're getting a lot of folks from Ireland and Italy and Russia and some of the Eastern European countries are coming in. So we were looking at those neighborhoods at any archaeology that was done there. We also wanted to look at the development of infrastructure in Baltimore, roads, sewer systems, electricity, public water, and things like that. So we had a lot that we really wanted to look at, and weren't sure how archaeology was really going to inform about all of those things, but we tried. And in particular, we looked a lot at what was going on in people's backyards and the changing uses of landscape, and how people really arranged their backyards. So we'll see some pictures in a minute of what some of the backyards look like over time. Early on, sort of in the 18th and early 19th centuries, a lot of the neighborhoods were mixed commercial and residential, and so somebody would have their business on the bottom floor of a building, and then they'd be living up above. And over time, though, that changed, and more commercial and industrial neighborhoods developed in residential neighborhoods, and that separation particularly as transportation systems got better and roads got better, people wanted to live away from where they worked. Baltimore, of course, is famous for its row houses. Baltimore has more row houses than any other city in the United States. And they are a wide variety of types, some of them as small as 10 feet wide. But others much fancier, like you can see in the ones in the upper left. The first row houses in Baltimore were built in the 1790s. That was something that came over, this building tradition came over from England. And the idea was to give a wider range of economic families at different economic levels, a chance to actually be homeowners. By building these houses spaced very close together. The earliest ones were built of wood. That wasn't such a great idea. And so pretty soon they started being built of brick and masonry. So this is an early 20th century photograph of sort of the typical row house backyards. And you can see that everybody has their fenced yards. There'd be these service alleyways that would go behind the houses for things like cleaning out your privies or other kinds of deliveries and things like that. And this looks pretty good compared to this slightly later photograph, where you can see the alley it's gotten very narrow. It's very muddy. You can see it running up through the center here. And all of these buildings, little shacks that you see here with the pipe, these are all privies. So these are all the things that we find a lot of traces of privies in these backyards. And you can see sort of the range of activities that people are doing. Somebody looks like they have like a potting shed or a potting table, or I don't know, it looks like bottles and things on it. So lots of people doing things in their backyards and building these sort of extra spaces and sheds off the back to provide them with a little bit more space. So privy, I want to talk a little bit about privies because archaeologists do find them so useful, the assemblages that are in them. Prior to urban sanitation, and I will say that Baltimore was one of the last cities in the United States to get running water, citywide water, and citywide sanitation. And it was not until the early 20th century that some places in Baltimore actually got city sewer and running water. So these privies that are in those backyards are being used well into the 20th century. And they need to be cleaned out on a fairly regular basis. And so the first thing that would the first system would be these wagons that would come in the middle of the night. These night soil men would come with buckets and barrels and go in your backyard, and they would have to come at night, and they couldn't come in the summertime. They would made them come in the winter when the smells wouldn't be quite so overwhelming. And so they would come and clean out the privies in the middle of the night, and it must have been the world's worst job. But by the mid 19th century, a vacuum pump for cleaning out privies had been invented. And so it was this mechanism that you see down here on the lower right. And you would put this hose down inside the privy, and it would suck up everything that was smaller than the privy, than the nozzle of the hose. And so the reason that I think that there's so many almost completely reconstructible vessels in a lot of these privies is because you would break a cup or a bottle or something, and human nature being what it is, you're going to go to the closest place that you can to clean it out. And so I think that a lot of the smaller pieces were being sucked up by this vacuum, and that the larger pieces were staying in the bottom of the privy. And so that's why when we excavate these privies, we can find so much that's actually reconstructible. All right, a little bit about the history of archaeology in Baltimore. And one of the earliest excavations, well, in the 60s and early 70s, a bunch of laws were passed. Federal laws were passed that protected cultural and resources, and archaeological sites and structures were required to have some level of documentation if any kind of federal funding was being spent. And so one of the first projects that happened in Baltimore after these Section 106 laws is what they're called, was passed, was the Federal Reserve Bank site. And that is a site that is near the Convention Center, if anybody has familiar with Baltimore. And it was sort of a two square block area. And the archaeologists went out after the backhoes had already cleared out the building that was already there and done a lot of damage. And so you can see in the lower right-hand side kind of what they were faced with. It was late winter, and so there was really cold. They were given 3 weeks time, and they were able to dig about 50 archaeological features, privies, wells, building foundations, and that sort of thing. And so they were able to get this amazing amount of information out, even water screening in the middle of the winter in mud puddles to recover seeds and other types of small finds like pins and things like that. The real sort of backbone of archaeology in Baltimore was the Baltimore Center for Urban Archaeology that was in operation between 1983 and 1997. And it was started under the direction of Elizabeth Comer after Baltimore Mayor William Donald Schaefer had gone to Annapolis and seen Dr. Mark Leone's work with the Historic Annapolis Foundation and his Archaeology in Annapolis project. And so he wanted the same thing for Baltimore. And so he hired Elizabeth Comer, and they got a crew together and hired a lab director. And the first thing that they did was the Great Baltimore Brewery Dig, which was conducted in the summer of 1983. And Elizabeth did such a great job. She had so much publicity. She had blue chip under disadvantaged youth in Baltimore coming out and helping. She had a weekly radio spot and lots of newspaper articles. He came out to visit and excavated And they just had and lots of public tours. And so that really started off a series of excavations of all sorts of properties in downtown Baltimore during a period when a lot of urban renewal was taking place. And so a lot of really interesting sites were excavated, and those collections, after the Baltimore Center for Urban Archaeology was in the urban, can't remember, the Urban Life Museum, that's not the right name, I'm sorry, was shut down. Those collections remained in Baltimore until about 8 years ago, when they finally came to the Mac Lab, and we have been able to make them accessible to researchers since that time. I want to talk a little bit about some of my favorite stories or features or sites from Baltimore. I worked with the Huntingtown High School Archaeology Club for many years, and we had to go to the school to work with the students because they couldn't actually leave the school. And so what we came up with, the park educator and I came up with, was carrying artifacts from the Federal Reserve site to the school, and we would pick like a feature a year for them to look at. And so I would go through and find something that I thought that the students could catalog and analyze and study over the course of one school year. And we would go and work with them on a weekly basis. And so when I was looking at this feature, just to see if it was a privy, to see if it was appropriate, I noticed that it was really different from most of the privy features that I had been looking at in Baltimore. There were lots and lots of eyeglasses, for one thing, and lots of kind of what I call one-off artifacts. And so I just started doing some research, and I found out that it was a retirement home for formerly enslaved people that was sponsored by 6 churches, 6 Black churches in Baltimore. And it was the aged home for men and women of the Methodist Church. And it was in operation from 1870 to about 1912. And then they moved to more northern part of town of the city. And the 1869 bird's eye view map of Baltimore, I can never pronounce this name right. Matthew, do you know how to pronounce this?
I would just be guessing. Sashi?
That's what I always say, and somebody told me that wasn't right, so I don't know. I'm just going to call it the sachet or sachet map. So
if the two of us are going to call it that, that is the official pronunciation, at least the duration of the talk.
So so you can see the structure on this map, and it's here sort of set back, and it's got this nice sort of fenced in yard, and it would hold the usually 25 to 30 people. And it was unusual because most of the retirement homes in Baltimore, particularly those for Black people, older people, were just for women. And there really didn't have a lot of places for men to go. So this one was unusual in that it had both male and female residents that were living there, and they really kind of lived hand to mouth. The churches kept asking Baltimore to help fund them, and the city and the state gave them very minimal funding. And so they came up with all of these really interesting ideas. They would have donation days where people could drop off groceries, but then they would also have entertainments where they had like a linen and candle rally where they had a big party, musical entertainment, and the price of admission was either a piece of bed linen, like a pillowcase or a sheet, or some candles that would help with the staffing and running of the place. They also had a potato rally at one point where the price of entry was a potato, to help feed the residents. And if you look at census records, which we did this project with the Huntingtown High School students, and the students really got into doing all of this ancestry research and all of that. And you can see these are a list of the names of the people that were residents at the retirement home at that time. And they were sort of, weirdly enough, they were called inmates instead of residents. But these documents the census records were able to tell us a lot about those residents and where they were born and how old they were and what kind of health problems they suffered. And the archaeological assemblage was really interesting. There was this one set of fairly nice, you think about sort of these kind of institutional organizations, and you think that they're going to have this really thick hotel china that's almost impossible to break, but they had this really nice, not decorated too much, a scalloped edge set of dishes that they served the inmates from. And those were fairly standard. There was a lot of those in there. But then I think the thing that drew me to this collection the most was that there were a lot of what I called one-off artifacts. So this really nice, highly decorated Victorian porcelain saucer, this perfume bottle, glass perfume bottle, a sake bottle, Japanese porcelain, this really beautiful late 19th century spiral decorated tumbler. And I think that these were things that were people's individual possessions that they brought with them when they came into this retirement home. And I think this is a really great story of the community caring for its own. A lot of these enslaved people had been separated from their families during enslavement, and they didn't have anybody to help take care of them. So this institution was to help people like that didn't have any family left. Another one of the privies that was associated with the Federal Reserve site was actually a privy that was filled with medical supplies. And I did some research, and this is actually a picture from Istanbul, but it's hard to find pictures of 19th century hospitals. So this was the Southern Dispensary, which, if you want to think of it in kind of modern day terms, it would be like the neighborhood clinic that you go to in the middle of the night, when your child is spiking a fever. It was a clinic that would deal with, sort of minor non-life-threatening injuries like broken limbs and, colds and flus and stuff like that. And it was something that was subsidized by revenue from donations from charitable organizations and fines levied on houses of ill repute. So it was basically free health care for people in that neighborhood. And so some of the archaeological finds that were in that assemblage, we had so this is a complete example from a picture from online, but sort of salve jars that would have been used from anything like Vaseline or lotions to lip balm, pestles, a mortar bowl for grinding medicine. This is a pill tile here. And I think that this is part of a bloodletting device. If you can see this, this glass vacuum here, that's what I believe that this is. And bloodletting was something that was used frequently in the 19th century. This little device down here, can y'all see my arrow?
Yes.
Okay, all right. This little device is called a scarificator. And I actually found one of these in Williamsburg on a mental hospital excavation from the 1880s. And if you turned it over, you see this little lever here. Underneath here are a series of slots. And when you press this button, a bunch of razor blades come out and slice you. And so they would slice you with a scarificator and then put the cupping device on you and use a vacuum to draw the blood out and draw out the ill humors. Lots of medicine bottles, and then this really interesting lens device that was part of a flea glass. And flea glasses are normally used for looking at insects and things like that, but they were also used medically. And I think that it was very similar to what you see here in this antique example from online. So a sort of a rudimentary microscope. We also found pieces of a stethoscope tube, and part of what I think is the top of a leach jar, also another bloodletting device. So there were a lot of industries in Baltimore. Baltimore was really big in the sugar refining business. The first sugar refinery opened in 1794. And by 1825, there were 11 refineries in Baltimore. And the raw sugar would be brought in from the Caribbean, and then it would be processed and refined. And the excavations were done at the Tool and Chute sugar refinery that was in business between 1804 and 1829. And they found all sorts of the sugar molds and the cones and the syrup jars in the excavation. And you can see here from Diderot what the process looked like with these cones that go down into the jars for that. Lots of pottery was made in Baltimore too. The stoneware industry was really big starting in the late 18th century. And in fact, the first archaeological site that was recorded in Baltimore was the Thomas Morgan pottery. It has the site 18 BC 1. So the first site recorded in the city, and it was excavated by the Archaeological Society of Maryland in the 1960s under the sort of direction of Smithsonian curator John Sprinkle, who was really interested in the potteries of Baltimore, and so he talked them into doing some work there. I like this piece down here on the bottom. Sorry, I'm a little bit distracted because I think there's a fire in my neighborhood. There's all kinds of emergency vehicles all out there. So anyway, just letting you know. I like this redware vessel here. It's got this black glaze on it. It's kind of a fine pasted redware. And it's got this design that's very reminiscent of sort of federal, early 19th century federal period teapots and coffee pots. And I think what happened is that this was probably coated with a silver luster to be an inexpensive substitute for a silver coffee or teapot at your house. If you couldn't afford that, you could get one that kind of looked like it. And it is molded in this design, this sort of fluted design that was very, very common for silver teapots during that time period. And there was a big redware industry in Baltimore in the early 19th century. And this, I believe, was one of the pieces that was made in Baltimore. And then this piece, this Rockingham pitcher, is just phenomenal. It's molded on both sides. It's called Stag and Deer Hunt, and it was made by the Edwin W. Bennett Pottery in the mid-19th century. And he had come over from England. He had been trained over in the Staffordshire potteries, and he was a really excellent mold maker. And these his pottery, his Rockingham pottery with molded designs, is considered some of the finest of its type in the United States. And so, and it really is, it's beautifully done. There were a lot of industrial potters too. There was a guy that was making cylinders for stovepipes as well. So you would go inside the iron pipes of cast iron stoves that would be used like in trains and things like that to help prevent fire. So a lot of industrial uses as well. Now, archaeology is near and dear to archaeologists' heart. I know that everybody knows about Natty Boh and National Bohemian beer being brewed in Baltimore, but Baltimore has been home to over 115 breweries since 1749. And the earliest was the Barnett's Brewery that opened in 1749. By 1850, there were 11 breweries in the city. And even more after German immigrants started arriving, and they brought with them their traditions of lagered beers, and so started producing lagered beers. And the sachet map has got, I don't know if any of y'all have ever seen that. It's, first of all, it's enormous if you see it at its full size. It's like covers up almost an entire like wall. But it has all of these vignettes across the top and sides of all of the breweries in Baltimore. And so you can see some of them in the more northern parts of the city had these big beer parks that people could go, just beer gardens like have become popular today. Some of the earliest breweries were along Jones Falls, which was actually a waterway in the 18th and 19th century. I think it's really been not quite as visible these days. One of the things that these breweries needed was access to water for the beer itself, for a place to dump waste, and also a place to ship their beer in and out. And so there were some of the earliest breweries were right along Jones Falls. And one of those breweries was the Claggett Brewery, which was the subject of that first 1983 great Baltimore brewery dig done by the BCUA. And while they didn't find quite as much evidence of the brewery buildings during the excavation, they had been kind of destroyed by a later casket company that was built on the same location. They did find about 3 dozen of these malting floor tiles. These are about a foot square, and they've got all these hundreds of little holes in them. And these were used to floor the flooring in the malting house. It would spread out the sprouted hops on the tops of these, on this floor, and then there'd be a furnace down below, and the heat would rise up through these little holes, and the heat would keep that sprouted malt from growing, so that they could use it, the barley, they could use it to produce malt. So these are pretty interesting. These were made in England in the mid-19th century. They did quite a lot of research on those. Another brewery was, or not brewery, but another production factory was the Phillips Brothers production factory. They made non-alcoholic beverages, carbonated beverages like sarsaparilla and ginger ale. And they had this really great boxing scene, both on their bottles and on their paper labels. So anytime they're very distinctive when you find them archaeologically. And they were they were operating between 1893 and the 1930s. And one of the things that they're best known for is this state-of-the-art equipment that you can see here, a bottling equipment that could fill and bottle and cap 30,000 bottles a day, which is pretty incredible. I don't know if you all, little known fact that makes me happy is that the crown cap which is what is used to cap beer bottles and soda bottles before when they're glass bottles, was invented in Baltimore in 1892. Some of the smaller scale industries, sort of shop, household level, Bernard Zell was in business between 1803 and 1833 on Pearl Street, and he was a soap and candle maker. And this beautiful canister came from his property. He used it, I think, to store lye soap. This is the nice looking side of this vessel. It's got, you can see some of the glaze that's falling off here, and it's all stained and spalled on the inside as well. And I think that came from damage from the lye soap that was stored in that container. Over where the Metro Shot Tower station is, some excavations were done before that Metro got put in, and they dug on the site of Henry Dukehart, who was a baker. There were lots and lots of bakers in Baltimore, both sugar bakers who were doing sweet things like cakes and pies, and then bakers who, in a town that was a port city, were making hardtack and ship's biscuits. And so there were 48 bakeries in the 1803 business directory in Baltimore, and that number had increased by 90 to 94 by the mid-1830s. And so if you think about the importance of being able to outfit ships with everything that they need to make those voyages. So Henry Dukehart was operating between 1780 and 1807, and he had a small bakery on Baltimore Street. And his bakery itself was in the front part of the house, but the archaeologists excavated a workyard that was out back. And what they found, it was a paved workyard, and they found a pit that was filled with ash that they interpreted as being part of a small oven that they think that he was using to make brandies and extracts. And when they floated the ash from that pit, they found 107,000 seeds from 39 different species of plants. Things like figs, grapes, strawberry, raspberries, blueberries, elderberries. And so they concluded that he was making probably perfumes and extracts and brandying, making brandy out of some of these fruits. And he may have been making the extracts that would go in this, like this little highly decorated bottle that was found in the privy that was also in his back workyard. So a lot of archaeology was done on the wharves and piers in Baltimore. And this excavation shot is from Brown's Wharf in the 1980s. And this is a really beautiful wooden barrel that's being excavated from a very damp, wet environment. So it preserved that wooden barrel over time. A lot of the land in Baltimore was built out. So this probably would have been a waterfront street in the 18th century. And they kept building out the land with these wharves and warehouses on it to accommodate all of the businesses that were required to keep the port and the wharves running. So when they cleaned out the barrel, they found about 60 menhaden in the barrel. And at first they thought, well, gosh, this was, evidence of salted fish being shipped over. And then they researched and realized that menhaden, that they were menhaden, first of all, and that menhaden were not really considered a food fish. They were used as fertilizer. They were used in paint. So probably they had, what they finally concluded, and this is Louis Akerson, with all of the fish lined up, what they concluded was that the fish like got trapped in the barrel and then couldn't figure out how to get out and died in the barrel. So there were some other things like a candlestick and a pair of scissors and things like that in the barrel as well. The barrel came to us along with the collections. The fish, I don't know, they must have discarded them, but some of the fish didn't make it to us at all. So those were lost to time. There was also a lot of really interesting finds about how wharves and piers were constructed using crib construction, which is really big wooden boxes that are sort of immersed into the water and filled with rubble and household like city household debris. And so there were a lot of really interesting artifacts in those cribs as well, and that whole process of how they built the land out to make these wharves. Now, of course, Baltimore suffered one of the worst fires, city fires in the nation in 1904. And this is one of the devastating, the photographs that shows that devastating damage. It was also an ice storm happened during the days that the fire was raging through Baltimore. So a lot of the photos have a lot of ice shown everywhere. It burned a huge amount of the sort of the older parts of the city. You can see the scope of the fire there. And some of the buildings that were excavated, there was a store that was excavated that showed ample evidence of that fire, in the store goods and like canned food that was burned, and peas, and this is a bunch of newspapers that survived in charred form in that fire. No, one of my it doesn't really tell us too much about the Chinese American immigrants that were in Baltimore, but it's a fun assemblage all the same. This is also from the Federal Reserve, and when they excavated in 1980, there was a big utility trench, sewer line, and so they opened it up, and there was a sewer pipe inside, and so for some reason they decided to break open the pipe, and when they did, they found that the bottom half of the pipe was filled with this concreted mass of rusted iron, and then all sorts of pins and buttons and all kinds of stuff. This is an X-ray of that same piece, and so you can see all sorts of things showing up that you can't see from the surface. And so doing some research into what was happening or what was going on where this pipe was located, it was a Chinese laundry. And that was listed in the 1922 Polk City directory. And so this pipe was being clogged with things that fell off of people's clothes, or you can see all of the buttons and the pins, or things that people had in their pockets that they forgot to take out. Like this Hoover presidential button, pieces of jewelry. This looks like it's from a graduation tassel, all kinds of buttons. This is a worker's tool tag. If you, this was a clothing factory located in Baltimore. If you went in and wanted a special pair of scissors, you would turn your tool tag over to the person that managed all the tools, and they'd hang this tool tag up where they took the scissors from. And at the end of the day, you needed to bring it back, or else you were responsible for that particular piece of equipment. These are all laundry tools. These are the things that were used to attach paper tags to the clothes. These marked pens were used to mark bags of laundry. They put all your underwear or whatever in one mesh bag and track it with this pen that had a number on it. And then these slate pencils were used for circling stains on clothes. So that was a really fun assemblage. We took apart one, they broke the pipe up into a whole bunch of sections, and we took apart one and conserved the artifacts, and then the rest we still have at the lab in like little foot-long sections. All right. we can use archaeology to look at how properties change over time and how the fortunes of the property in the neighborhoods can change over time. And this is the Sellers Mansion, which was built on the Lafayette Square section of town, a very fashionable section of town in the late 1850s when it was built. And it was built by Matthew Sellers, who ran the Northern Central Railway. And his neighborhood was very fashionable at the time. You can see here's Lafayette Square Park, and here's his house over here on the right-hand side. You can see it's a 3-story house with a mansard roof built in sort of Second Empire style, and had all kinds of ornate roof and plaster work. And the Sellers, lived there for many years, and the neighborhood started sort of disintegrating around them. Sellers' son and daughter continued to live in the house until they died, even though the neighborhood had changed from being fashionable to being one that was lower economic status and predominantly Black at the time. And that started around the 1930s. The house, after they died, the house was auctioned off in 1955 and then extensively restored and was used for a variety of community purposes throughout the 90s. It was the Baltimore Housing and Urban Renewal Agency for a while. It was the headquarters for Operation Champ for a while, which brought in professional athletes to work with neighborhood children. And then it was used as a community center by a church that was in the area. And then it was finally abandoned and slowly started disintegrating, as you can see in this lower left-hand picture. And this was Adam took this picture of it while we were writing this book. And then while the book was at the press and about to come out, some vagrant who had gone into the house for shelter set it on fire accidentally in, I think, February of 2023, and it destroyed the roof, and they actually pushed the house down, and so it has been destroyed. But in 2018, Adam went out with a bunch of students and did some archaeology and sort of looked at how the property had changed through time. They found this section here is what was called a spite wall. I guess Matthew Sellers went to Europe for a long time. And when he returned in 1875, he found that somebody had built a house very close up to him. And so he didn't want to look at that. It ruined his view. So he built a 40-foot tall wall to hide that property from his view. And so that wall remained standing until the 1960s when it was finally torn down. But this is traces of that wall. And then there were lots of drug paraphernalia that Adam and them found in their archaeological work. This sort of as well as things that sort of trace the community use of the property over time, game pieces and things like that. So archaeology can be a way to connect people with the changing past. Just a few final slides, some of my favorite artifacts. So this is the Federal Reserve Bank that was built over the site of where a lot of the things that I talked about tonight were. And what was discovered in one of the privies there that dates to the mid-19th century was a piece of a cast iron bank. So it was a bank, and this is what it would have looked like complete and painted. There was a bank that was found at the bank. And so the bank was very excited. The Federal Reserve Bank was very excited about that, and they'd like to get it to put on this display. Lots of evidence of public health kinds of concerns. These are spit cups Tuberculosis was a really dangerous disease that was rampant in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so we find lots of evidence of these cups that you could walk around with and spit into. And this one fit down into the top of a cup that you can see here. So you can easily walk around with your spit cup. One of my favorites is this big fragment from a plate that is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad design. And one of the things that the Staffordshire potters over in England were doing is they wanted to be able to market pottery or ceramics to the American audiences. And so they would come over, send artists over to the United States to do engravings and sketches of places of public interest, public libraries, schools, churches, mansions, and then they would engrave them on copper plates and make these transfer printed ware plates and saucers and sets, dinner sets and things like that. And this pattern on the back, it says B&O Railroad, and it was produced by Enoch Wood and Sons in the late 1820s or early 1830s. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad groundbreaking was in 1828 on July 4th, and it was believed to have been produced pretty soon after that. Now, the thing is not based on, this is what the entire plate would have looked like. It was actually based on a railroad that was in England. So this is not an actual picture of what the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad would look like, but they did feel like that there was probably this huge audience in the United States that would want to celebrate this coming of this technology to the United States. And then just some cool stuff, a glass salt cellar, some of the most beautiful painted overglazed Chinese porcelain that I have ever seen. I mean, each piece, there's a whole set of it, and each piece is just painted with these beautiful designs. A nice leaded crystal decanter, toothbrush, bone-handled toothbrush that still has the bristles, the hog's hair bristles that you can see, wine bottle seals, and these really fabulous sort of third to early fourth quarter of the 19th century marbles. So fun stuff. And then here's some of the students from the Archaeology Club who are doing work with ceramics, so mending with the collections, mending ceramics, cataloging them. One of the sets of one year, the students got so excited that they did a bunch of research and actually found an ancestor of the family whose privy we were looking at and called him in Punta Gorda, Florida. He was 95 years old and still working every day, and he'd been a history major at Yale. And so they called him up and talked to him about their research. It was so great. These students would catalog the artifacts, mend them, choose artifacts to research and write about, and then they would do an exhibit each year that would go into the public library for a month, and then it would go up in their school for the rest of the year. And then we would go up to the bank every year and give a presentation to the bank employees. So they got reading skills and public speaking skills and research skills, and they got lots of hands-on. And so it was a really great project, a really great program that unfortunately COVID killed. We're trying to get it started back up again. And then I just want to plug some of our resources from the lab as my sort of final slide. Our diagnostic artifacts in Maryland, which will help you with identifying artifacts from your sites, both pre-contact and contact historic artifacts. If you want to know more about the collections that are in the MAC lab, Maryland Unearthed will tell you the collections that are available for study. Every month we do a monthly series that highlights an artifact from our collections and do a sort of a poster size essay with a lot of pictures in that. And then some other seeds and pollen studies, wood and charcoal identification, a fun Artifacts of Outlander exhibit for those of you who are big Outlander fans, and then a blog that we use artifacts from our collections to look at sort of some larger themes in Maryland's history. So I think that is it. Yes. So I'd like to thank the following people. Matthew, thank you for inviting me to talk tonight. And I'm happy to take any questions.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Question in the chat about the status of the Laurel Cemetery project. Were African American burials found that were missed during shopping center construction in the early 1960s?
You know, I don't know anything about that. I do know that, do we know where did those human remains that were removed in the 1960s go? Does anybody know?
Steve, do you know anything about that? It was your question.
No, I don't. I was curious to find out.
Yeah, I can look into that and let Matthew know so he can get back in touch with you, unless you want to try to send me an email. I know that right now, one of the projects that we're doing at the Mac Lab is we do have 73 sets of human remains, historic period human remains. And of those 73 sets of human remains, about 13 of them are of African ancestry. And so we would like to get all the human remains in the Mac Lab back in the ground and back in the hands of potential family members or descendants, I should say, not ancestors. And so we decided to start with the African ancestral remains, and we've been working for the last year and a half with the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture and the Banneker Douglas Tubman Museum, and we've got a working group. And these remains are from 5 different counties in Maryland, and we've had meetings with the interested public and descendant communities in all of those counties, and we are hoping to get the first set of ancestral remains back into the hands of descendants by June of this year, so that they can be put back in the ground in a historic Black cemetery that's pretty close to where they were removed in the, I think this set was removed in the late 70s when a house went up and there was a big cemetery, both of Black and white folks at this location. So we've got white remains and Black remains from that cemetery, but we're gonna try to get the Black remains reburied at this historic church that's nearby. So I'm kind of curious about where the Laurel remains went in the 1960s, if they got reburied or what happened to them.
Yeah, I'm curious too. If you can find that out, and I will pass it on to our folks in the group today. Cool.
Okay.
I'm thinking about those medical devices that you showed, and just, like, and anytime you think about like medical practices of like 100 years ago, it's slightly terrifying. What was in it? Like, what was the box that you press a button and razor blades come out? Was it like the scarificator or something?
Scarificator.
Oof.
Yes. Well, and it's pretty innocuous looking, right? And then, the place that I found, it was an all metal one, and I guess it was a mental hospital that was in Williamsburg that burned in 1885, I think, and it was in with the remains, some of the fire debris. And I guess, it looked pretty innocuous, where you just have this metal box and then you press a button and these things pop out, and people, if they hadn't had it done to them before, they wouldn't know what was coming, right? So
So what was something you found that was really surprising, like looking back on all of this, something that you just didn't expect?
Mm, You know, I think I think the sewer pipe filled with debris.
Yeah.
But I really that was something that I would have never really thought to break that sewer pipe open to take a look at that. I think um, the just the variety of things that have happened. I didn't really know as much about Baltimore as I should have before I started working on this book, but I think just fascinated by um, how many breweries there were in Baltimore and how important, the beer industry was there. And I had no idea that sugar was refined in Baltimore, even though the Domino Sugar Factory is still there today. I just had no idea about the types of industry that were in Baltimore.
Awesome. So Pat in the chat wants to know, can you mention the special dress you own that had the hidden code?
Oh, that was Sarah Rivers Cofield, who is our federal curator. And she bought that dress, I believe her parents live in Maine, and I believe she bought that dress in Maine on one of her trips there. And it, if I'm remembering correctly, the papers were, I don't know if they were in the bustle part, how the women's dresses at that time had kind of a bustle thing that stuck out of the back. I don't know if they were in some sort of pocket that was near there, or if they were inside the bustle to sort of provide lift and stiffen the fabric a little bit. But it turns out that they had code written on them, and she couldn't figure out what the code was. And so she sent this um she sent some examples of the code to this sort of group that tries to break codes, and somebody figured out that it was weather codes for predicting weather, like doing I guess like Morse code to send to people to show what the weather was going to be or what the weather had been in certain places. So it wasn't a spy or anything like that. It was weather codes. And she thought that perhaps that the husband was the person that was either sending out these codes or was the whatever you called a meteorologist in the late 19th, mid to late 19th century. And that he had left some paper on the table and she sort of picked it up and used it. But I think there's a bunch of articles online, about it. If you want to learn more about it, I can ask Sarah to give me a list of or some links to where those are as well. But it was pretty fascinating. She's had really incredible luck with finding really beautiful and interesting clothes. That's her side hobby is historic clothing.
I think Sarah did a presentation for us on horse culture, like Chesapeake.
Yes.
Yeah, and folks can check that out on YouTube if they want to, but she has some really amazing like artifacts attached to like keeping horses and riding horses. That was neat.
Yeah, that's her work love is all things horse related. And we're getting ready in the spring to relaunch a newly updated diagnostic artifacts in Maryland website that will be searchable through links and through sorry. Um, it will be searchable
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you'll be able to sort in lots of ways, and it will be mobile friendly. So if you're out in the field digging, it'll be a lot easier to use. And we're adding a bunch of new categories. While we've been reformatting this website, which has been like a 4-year job, trying to get everything in a format that can be searched and Excel and Access database and new photographs and all that kind of stuff. But we've also been adding new categories so that website will be relaunched sometime this coming spring with a bunch of new categories as well. And a lot of horse stuff will be in there, as well as cutlery and jaw harps and thimbles will also be in there. And we're working on tobacco pipes too. So
it's the second time you've mentioned jaw harps, and I wouldn't have thought that that was like a major source of archaeological artifacts, but I mean, I guess
well,
it's
you know, when
an
people
instrument that
find them,
anyone can play, right?
yeah, when people find them, they want to know what they date to, you know, and so I was like, all right, I'll see what I can find out. So I
Yeah.
spent a lot of time looking into jaw harps, and I found that there's a bunch of different types, and they do have some dating potential.
There's a bunch of different types. I'm gonna have to look that up now because that's
Lots of
how many
different
different types of jaw harps could there be? But now I want to know.
well, there's at least 8 different types in the Mac lab.
Okay.
And we don't have all of it. It's a very niche subject, as you can
All right.
imagine.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Same thing with thimbles. Thimbles were interesting too. So
Really. And then we have one more question here, if you don't mind. Do you find a lot of construction done with lead metal?
construction done with lead metal. I'm not, you may have to elaborate on that question some more.
Richard, what did you mean by that? Lead pipes.
Oh, so it seems like if archaeologists find there were lead pipes, but they didn't really make it into our collections. More modern materials like that, the archaeologists tend to just sample or mostly discard. But lead was a big problem, and lead was being used to glaze pottery, for a long, long time. And so that was also not great for your health too, particularly it would react with acidic foods like tomatoes and lemon juice and stuff like that. And so if you've got, I always tell people if they have a collection of Yellowware bowls, they shouldn't use them for anything acidic, because they could the lead could leach out into their food. So, but yeah, lead pipes were used up until when they started using the copper pipes, and it did provide a source of lead in people, lead poisoning.
Were there other construction materials used besides lead?
For
Well,
pipes?
somebody's saying that early water pipes were made of hollowed out logs in Pennsylvania. That's interesting.
Yes, they were. And I don't think we don't have any hollowed out wooden water pipes in the lab, but I have seen them in other collections. And then sewer pipes were made of glazed stoneware. So there were some, but those were sewer pipes. Those weren't water. Ceramic pipes were not water. Didn't carry water. They carried sewer. But a lot of that construction material like that just doesn't make it into the lab. People don't really save it. And I think samples should be saved. But a lot of times, particularly sort of when a lot of this early archaeology was being done, a lot of that stuff just got discarded and didn't get sampled at all.
Right. So if people wanted to come see some of this stuff in the lab, do we know when the lab will be open again to the public?
So I'm hoping, I don't know for sure, because they're supposed to finish in April, but that's substantial completion. And so then we've got to get everything. We had to move all of the oversized objects out, and then we've got to move everything back to where it was. So I'm hoping by the end of next year we can welcome the public back in, but it might be a little bit later than that.
Cool. I look forward to that. One more question has just come in, if you have time here. I understand that sand was mined under Federal Hill Park for glass making. You want to comment on that?
Yes, and there's an article, I think, in the Archaeological Society of Maryland. Wait, I can look it up probably in a minute, but I'll try to look it up and talk at the same time. It's really fascinating that there are all of these tunnels that are still present under Federal Hill. And I think it was Louise Akerson who went in and who went in and documented those tunnels, and then documented a lot of some things that were found in those tunnels. Like there was some evidence of like liquor being stored in there by one of the breweries, was using it to store beer that they were for their tavern. Let me see if I can. So Louise Akerson wrote an article in Maryland Archaeology, 1994, volume 30, number 2, and it's called Rediscovering the Sand Tunnels of Federal Hill, Baltimore. It's worth a look because it's fascinating. And they were mining the tunnels for sand, and also I think for timber for pottery, for some of the pottery factories as well. So, but that really is worth a look, that article. And again, if you can't find it or have easy access, let me know, and I'll be happy to scan it and send it to you. But yeah, it was quite an adventure for her. And I guess the city was afraid that they were going to collapse. And so they wanted them documented.
That was the thought that I had when you say there's tunnels under Federal Hill.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, it's almost 8:30, so we should wrap this up here. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Patricia
you.
Samford, everyone from the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab. That was super interesting and informative. Take care, everyone. Happy holidays, Happy New Year, etc. See you all back here in 2025. Thanks for your time, Tricia. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.